I grew up in a house where my name was always the second choice, where my sister's photographs lined the hallway and mine were tucked away in the attic. I thought I had learned to live with being overlooked until the day my parents gave her $5 million that was meant to be shared among us all. As I sat frozen in the family library, my grandfather, who everyone believed was too frail to speak, rose from his wheelchair. His voice cut through the silence. "I know exactly what you've been doing." In that moment, betrayal became undeniable and secrets began to unravel. The first thing that always struck me about Seacliff Manor wasn't its grandeur, but the silence that pressed against the walls. A silence too heavy to belong to any living home. When I stepped into the foyer that morning, my eyes caught the familiar line of framed photographs running up the grand staircase. Chloe's face, Chloe's milestones, Chloe smiling in dresses custom made for her recitals, her life immortalized in glossy portraits. My own pictures, when they existed, were tucked away in albums left to yellow in the attic. That hallway had always been a verdict. I was the afterthought. Miles squeezed my hand as though to tether me, though the grip reminded me as much of the distance between us as of his loyalty. His background was modest, his paycheck from teaching literature worlds apart from the Whitfield fortune. My parents never said it aloud, but I had long known they viewed him as another reason I could not be chosen. And now, as we walked toward the mahogany-panelled library, I feared this gathering would be the ultimate confirmation that I had never been and would never be the favoured child. The air in the library was dense with wood polish and old leather. Edward, my grandfather, sat slumped in his chair by the window, wrapped in a plaid blanket. His head bowed slightly, and I heard the faint wheeze of his breath. He looked diminished, too diminished to preside over a moment that could reshape our family's future. My father, Victor, stood near the hearth with the posture of a king surveying his kingdom. My mother, Lila, arranged herself like porcelain on a wingback chair, her expression already prepared for sympathy. And Chloe, of course, glowed in an elegant black dress, the colour of mourning chosen more for effect than necessity. Martin Hale, the family attorney, adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. His voice was practised, even rehearsed, as he unfolded the documents in his hands. As part of an early adjustment to Mr. Whitfield's estate plan, he began, certain transfers have already been executed. My pulse thudded in my ears. He spoke of fairness, of prudence, of streamlining, but the words blurred until he reached the heart of it. $5 million in liquid assets and 3 properties, Harbourcrest, Winmere Apartments and the Newport Estate, had been transferred solely to Chloe under the authority of my father's power of attorney. I felt a chill snake down my spine. Harbourcrest. That was the development I had spent years shaping, meeting with town officials, fighting for zoning concessions, embedding an affordable housing unit into the plans. It was not just concrete and blueprints to me. It was proof I could create rather than merely inherit. And now it had been handed over to Chloe, who had never attended a single community meeting, who had once asked me what zoning even meant. Miles's hand tightened, but it could not steady the vertigo. My breath came shallow, the library tilting around me. My father's gaze swept over me, cool and rehearsed, and in that glance I read the dismissal he had carried all my life. Not chosen, not worthy, not enough. My mother looked at Chloe with pride that seemed to burn brighter in contrast to the indifference she gave me. I tried to gather words to object, but my tongue felt heavy. Hale continued, droning about clauses and legal formalities, but my mind snagged on a single phrase I had noticed in a recent report. environmental encumbrances. Harbour Crest's land still bore the ghosts of an old chemical plant. We had cleared most of the concerns, but it was far from over. Contamination remained a possibility, lawsuits a looming shadow. The project wasn't just wealth, it was risk, possibly a poisoned gift. For a moment, bitterness flared hotter than despair. My parents had dressed betrayal in the guise of generosity. They had gifted Chloe a crown that could just as easily choke her. But even as the thought surfaced, I knew it wouldn't matter. She would be celebrated for receiving it, the darling child handed another treasure. And if the weight of the property crushed her later, they would blame the regulators, the market, the lawyers, never their decision. I wanted to speak, to demand why years of my dedication had been erased by a signature, but the words would not form. In their silence, I heard the echo of my childhood. Every time Chloe's victories had been trumpeted, while mine were quietly filed away. The room seemed to shrink, the oak shelves pressing closer, as though the library itself had chosen to forget me. And still, I sat there, spine stiff, eyes burning, swallowing the familiar taste of abandonment. The silence that followed Martin Hale's announcement was suffocating, thick as smoke. Chloe sat straighter, as if $5 million had already gilded her shoulders with invisible jewellery. My father clasped his hands behind his back in the pose of a conqueror who had no need to celebrate victory aloud. And my mother let out a sigh, the kind meant to sound mournful but carried a note of satisfaction. Then a sound broke through, a shuffle of fabric against wood. My grandfather, Edward Whitfield, pushed the plaid blanket off his knees. For a moment, I thought it was a tremor, the involuntary twitch of a man in decline. But then he gripped the arms of his chair and, with a steadiness that startled everyone, rose to his feet. The nurse gasped. Chloe's hand flew to her mouth. Victor froze, every trace of practiced calm draining from his face. Edward's voice, though gravelly with age, carried across the library with clarity. "That will you just heard," he said, "is a forgery." The words detonated like dynamite in the room's hushed grandeur. Hale blinked rapidly, his composure fracturing. My mother stiffened, the pearl necklace at her throat trembling with her pulse. Chloe's complexion paled, as though the crown she had been given had suddenly sprouted thorns. From his breast pocket, Edward drew a small silver flash drive, the metal catching the muted light of the chandelier. He held it aloft like a relic. "The true documents are here," he said, "and a duplicate rests in Judge Alvarez's safe. Every irregular transfer, every falsified authorization, every misuse of my name, it is all preserved." My father finally found his voice, brittle and urgent. "Dad, you shouldn't strain yourself. Let's sit you back down. We can discuss this in private." "Silence, Victor." The command cut sharper than any shout. "I've been silent long enough." He turned, sweeping the room with his gaze until it landed on me. For the first time in months, maybe years, his eyes were lucid, sharp, the eyes of the man who had once built empires from crumbling bricks. "The power of attorney you claim," Edward continued, "was signed during the very weeks my doctors were paraded in to declare me incompetent." Convenient, wasn't it? My heart pounded. The dates, the signatures, the sudden acceleration of Chloe's involvement in the company, it all aligned. The betrayal was no longer vague suspicion. It was documented theft. Edward's voice dropped, deliberate. "And let me tell you something none of you expected. I have not been as feeble as I appeared." The words seemed to bend the air itself. Chloe whispered a protest, but it died in her throat. My mother pressed a hand to her chest, shaking her head as though denial might make time reverse. Edward straightened further, shoulders squared despite the weight of his years. I pretended, yes. I allowed you to believe I was fading faster than I truly was. I wanted to see what my family would do when they thought I was too weak to intervene. I needed to know who was loyal to the Whitfield name and who was loyal only to themselves. The revelation struck me like a blow. My grandfather's weakness, those vacant gazes, those faltering words, hadn't been all real. He had orchestrated his own decline as a test, which meant my parents' treachery had bloomed under conditions deliberately contrived. A flush rose in my cheeks, heat chasing away the chill that had numbed me moments earlier. If Edward had been watching all along, then my entire life of being overlooked, passed over, cast aside, had that too been part of his test? A calculated blindness to see how I would endure? The thought twisted inside me, equal parts fury and desperate relief. I wanted to shout, to demand why he had let me carry the weight of abandonment for decades. But I also wanted to fall into his arms and weep, grateful that someone, at least, had not been deceived by my parents' performance. Edward's gaze softened when it met mine again, as though he could read the turmoil on my face. "Not all trials are fair, Nora," he said, quieter now, but still unwavering. "But truth, once revealed, cannot be ignored. The time for pretending is over." The room, once suffocating with silence, now pulsed with chaos, restrained by fear. My father's jaw clenched, my mother's eyes darted like cornered prey, Chloe's knuckles whitened against the arm of her chair. And me, I stood on the edge of a precipice, realizing that my exile, my role as the forgotten daughter, might not have been mere cruelty. It might have been the collateral damage of an elaborate game my grandfather had set in motion. For the first time in my life, I wondered if being forsaken had been less a verdict and more a strategy. The days after my grandfather's revelation felt like living inside a fault line, every tremor threatening to split the ground beneath me. Documents surfaced like bones unearthed from shallow graves. Balance sheets that once seemed solid now read like riddles. Numbers inflated beyond recognition. Development costs multiplied without explanation. The West Haven project, which I had nursed from blueprint to groundbreaking, showed expenses that could have financed an entire city. Yet revenues were recorded as though the buildings stood empty, ghosts of tenants who never arrived. Edward asked me to review everything with him, but not alone. He had called in Caleb Stone, a retired FBI specialist whose calm presence carried the weight of decades spent tracking financial predators. His eyes were sharp, scanning pages like a hawk scanning open fields. "Patterns don't lie," he murmured, spreading reports across the table. "People do, but numbers, when they repeat, are a confession." And the patterns screamed betrayal. Employees had been reassigned quietly, veterans shuffled out to make room for fresh executives loyal to my father. Entire divisions collapsed under restructuring that made no operational sense. Marina, the nurse who had tended my grandfather with unassuming diligence, revealed something chilling. She had recorded my mother whispering on the phone late one night, her voice thin but urgent. "Keep him quiet. Don't let him agitate himself. The less he knows, the better." The recording trembled in my hands. My own mother, urging silence, orchestrating ignorance. Every memory of her brushing my hair before school or pressing a cool hand to my forehead when I was sick felt like counterfeit currency. Affection spent only when convenient. But what truly shattered me came not from my parents, but from a line buried in a funding report. Caleb traced a transfer marked as a charitable donation. an education grant routed through a private foundation. At first glance, it seemed routine philanthropy, the kind of gesture the Whitfields had used for generations to varnish their image. But then I saw the recipient's name, Carter Educational Trust. The letters blurred as my pulse surged. Carter, Miles's surname, my husband, the one man I believed had nothing to do with this labyrinth of deceit, suddenly tethered to a line item dripping with suspicion. I flipped the pages with shaking hands, looking for an explanation, a footnote, anything. But the numbers sat cold and unyielding. $200,000 funneled into a scholarship fund that bore my husband's name. For a moment, the library where we worked felt like it was closing in again, those shelves of leather-bound books leaning toward me, whispering, "Even he is not yours. Even he can be bought." Miles had never hidden his modest salary, the long hours he spent grading essays to make ends meet. Could this money have been slipped into his life somehow? Was his commitment to me as compromised as my parents' commitment to fairness? I wanted to dismiss it as coincidence, to tell myself Carter was a common enough name, but suspicion doesn't negotiate with reason. It sinks its claws deep, feeding on every insecurity already alive inside you. And for me, abandonment was a wound that never closed. The questions swirled. Had my parents known of this link? Had they chosen it deliberately, planting poison in the only relationship where I felt safe? Or worse, had Miles himself known? Had he accepted something I didn't? My throat tightened, the weight of betrayal, real or imagined, settling on my chest. I remembered my mother's whispered scorn the night of my engagement. A teacher? Really? What if she had found a way to make her prophecy come true, to prove Miles was no more loyal than the rest of them? Caleb noticed my stillness, the way my hands hovered over the paper. "Something's wrong," he said quietly. His eyes followed mine to the line of text, and though his expression remained professional, I caught the flicker of recognition. He knew this was more than numbers to me. I forced a nod, pushing the documents aside before the others could see the tremor in my fingers. Just another anomaly, I lied. But inside, doubt spread like ink spilled across a page. For years I had endured being left behind by my parents, overshadowed by Chloe, and dismissed by Victor. Now, the one person who was supposed to be unshakable, the one place I thought I belonged, felt suddenly uncertain. If even Miles was tangled in this, then perhaps I truly had no anchor at all. The suspicion sat in my chest like a stone until I forced myself to drag it into the light. I couldn't live with unanswered questions, not now, not with the family crumbling around me. So I asked Edward directly about the Carter Fund, my voice tight, braced for an answer that might end my marriage, in a single syllable. His brows lifted in surprise before softening into something almost tender. "Ah," he said, leaning back in his chair, "I established that trust nearly 15 years ago. I wanted to honour teachers, men and women who build futures without expectation of riches. Carter was the name of my own grade school mentor, nothing to do with Miles." The breath I had been holding spilled out in a rush, nearly dizzying. For a moment, the ground steadied beneath me. Miles was untouched, my one safe harbour still intact. Relief poured through me so quickly it hurt, like thawing skin after frostbite. But that reprieve lasted less than a day. The following morning, Caleb called me into his office. His face was grave, his hand gripping a printout. "This," he said, sliding the paper across the desk. It was an email. No sender name, no signature, just a shadow in the digital ether. Attached was a grainy photograph. Me, in the library, clutching my grandfather's silver USB drive. My expression was intent, my hands tight around the device. The image was damning, carefully framed to suggest secrecy. The subject line read, "Proof she is manipulating him." My stomach dropped. In a single click, the narrative had shifted. I wasn't the betrayed daughter anymore. I was cast as the schemer, the granddaughter pulling strings, while her grandfather feigned frailty. I shook my head, words tumbling out. This isn't what it looks like. I only touched it when he showed me, when... Caleb raised a hand. I believe you, but perception matters as much as fact. Someone wants to build a case against you. I stared at the picture, bile rising in my throat. The silver USB that had felt like a lifeline only nights ago now glared back as a weapon pointed at me. Can we trace it? I asked, my voice raw. Caleb nodded. Already started. The email was routed through layers of proxies, but breadcrumbs always remain. Whoever sent this wasn't as clever as they thought. Hours stretched as his team worked. I drifted between the walls of Seacliff Manor, feeling them close around me like prison bars. My parents barely looked at me, their silence a verdict. Chloe avoided my eyes altogether, her sympathy as fleeting as her loyalties. Only Edward's steady gaze reminded me that I wasn't losing my mind entirely. That night Caleb returned with his findings. He laid a folder before me, his expression tight. It came from inside the house. My pulse raced. Whose system? The origin server belongs to Martin Hale's office. The words crashed over me, dragging me under. Hale, the man who had served our family for decades, the attorney whose measured voice had presided over weddings, trusts, expansions. He was the one planting the seeds of my downfall. I gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white. Relief from Miles's innocence still lingered faintly, but it was devoured by a fresh wave of dread. The pendulum had swung violently. One moment I was exhaling, the next I was suffocating again. For so long my fear of abandonment had been about absence, about being overlooked. Now it had morphed into something sharper, being actively framed, cast out not by neglect, but by deliberate design. As I stared at the damning image, a thought rooted deep inside me. They weren't just willing to forget me, they were willing to destroy me. The meeting that Edward called with the board should have been a sterile affair. Numbers, charts, and motions approved with stiff nods. Instead, it became the theatre where truth cracked through the marble facade of our family. He sat at the head of the long oak table, his voice steady, his back straight, in a way that made me realise he had been conserving his strength for this very moment. The directors leaned forward, sensing the weight of what was coming. Before we proceed with structural changes, Edward began to there is a matter of blood to address. The room hushed, even the rustle of paper stilled. My father shifted, his jaw tense, as though anticipating a blow. Edward folded his hands, gaze fixed on Victor. For decades, I let you all believe that Victor Whitfield was my son by blood. He is not. The words detonated, silencing even the air itself. My chest constricted as though the floor had opened beneath me. Victor's face froze, unreadable. Lila's hand fluttered to his arm, more out of habit than comfort. Chloe gasped, her composure fracturing for once. Edward's eyes swept the table. Your grandmother Eleanor had an affair with my business partner, Charles Whitmore. Victor was the result. I discovered the truth only after Eleanor's death. I chose to raise him as mine. But truth does not vanish because we bury it. The revelation rippled outward like a stone dropped in water. Suddenly, the sharpness of Victor's ambition, his constant need to prove himself, his relentless control, it all reframed. A man born of betrayal, desperate to cement his place in a family that never truly belonged to him. And me, His daughter, perhaps I had inherited not just his blood but his exile. I remembered every time he looked through me as though I were transparent, every decision where Chloe had been chosen instead. Had he recognised in me the echo of his own displacement and punished me for reminding him? A wave of nausea rose. The cycle was grotesque. A man who had never been fully embraced had poured his alienation into his eldest child, replicating abandonment like a disease. Edward cleared his throat, reclaiming the board's attention. Given these truths, I have restructured the family trust. Effective immediately, I remain chair until I am unable. But succession will not fall to Victor and Lila. They are removed from management authority. The directors exchanged uneasy glances, but Edward pressed on. Nora will serve as primary trustee. Ryan as secondary. No major decision can pass without both signatures. Together they will steward Whitfield Properties. I felt the room tilt. For years I had clawed for scraps of acknowledgement. Now, suddenly, I was seated at the very centre of power. Yet the triumph felt hollow because it had been bought not through recognition of merit alone, but through the exposure of my parents' deceit. My father's lips parted, but no words emerged. He looked less like a titan of business and more like a child stripped of costume. My mother's face hardened. An actress denied her stage. Chloe stared down at her lap as though the weight of her undeserved crown had grown unbearable. Applause did not follow. Only silence thickened, broken by the scratching of pens as directors signed acknowledgements of the new structure, my name inked on documents that felt heavier than stone. I glanced at Ryan. His expression was mixed, part relief, part burden. He had spent years fleeing the company, chasing music across coasts, yet now the mantle of trustee rested on his shoulders too. We locked eyes, a silent recognition. Whatever storms lay ahead, we were bound together. And me. I wanted to revel in vindication, to scream that I had been right all along. But instead, a chill coiled around my heart, because power given in the shadow of betrayal is never clean. My parents had been cut out, but so had I. Once, again and again. The difference was that now the exclusion worked in my favour. And I could not shake the dread that in seizing this role I had become a mirror of the cruelty that had defined my family for decades. Triumph tasted of ash. The boardroom dissolved into whispers and shuffling papers, but my focus locked on my father's retreating figure. Victor moved stiffly down the corridor, his posture cracked, stripped of the authority he had worn like armour for so long. I followed him, my footsteps echoing against the marble floor, each one louder than my heartbeat. He stopped near the tall windows overlooking the gardens. His reflection shimmered against the glass, a man suddenly untethered from legacy. I stood behind him, pulse racing, before forcing the words out of my chest. "You never chose me," I said, the sentence trembling but sharp. "Not once, not when I worked the late nights, not when I begged for your trust, not even when I built Harbourcrest with my own hands. I was never enough for you." His shoulders stiffened. For a fleeting moment I thought he might turn, might meet my eyes with something human. Instead, silence spread between us, as vast as an ocean. "Say something," I pressed, voice breaking. "Tell me why I was never worth your faith. Tell me why Chloe could stumble and still be lifted high while I shattered myself to be seen." Still nothing. He lifted his chin, eyes on the horizon, lips sealed. That silence was worse than any insult, worse than every dismissal he had thrown my way. It was another act of abandonment, final and complete. Tears stung, hot and unwanted. You've left me behind my entire life, I whispered. And even now, with everything crumbling, you'd rather hold your silence than acknowledge me. Victor finally moved, but only to walk away. His footsteps carried him down the hall, fading until they left me standing alone in a corridor that suddenly felt colder than the stone beneath my shoes. I pressed a hand to the wall to steady myself. My father's silence had been the clearest answer he'd ever given. I had never been chosen, and I never would be. Later, wandering the library in search of some anchor, I found a drawer left ajar in one of the old cabinets. Inside was a faded envelope, its paper brittle with age, addressed in Eleanor's elegant script. My grandmother's hand. My fingers trembled as I unfolded the letter. It spoke of regret, of secrets buried with shame, and in one paragraph her words snared my breath. The child I carry now is a girl. She will have the Whitfield name, and she will be my redemption. My chest seized. Another daughter, another heir, hidden in the shadows? Could it be that there was someone else? Someone whose existence explained the distance, the favouritism, the strange gaps in our family history? The thought ignited a desperate flicker of hope. Perhaps I wasn't alone in this exile. Perhaps somewhere there was another daughter, a sister lost, someone who could understand what it felt like to be discarded. I clutched the letter like scripture, rushing to Edward with the discovery. His eyes scanned the lines, sorrow dimming his features. This child, he said softly, was never born. Eleanor lost her before the end of the pregnancy. A stillbirth, hidden even from the family at large. She wrote these words in hope, but they were swallowed by grief. The room swayed around me. The imagined sister, the phantom ally I had conjured in those few hopeful moments, dissolved into ash. My grandmother had carried emptiness, and that emptiness had bled into generations. I lowered the paper, fingers numb. So it was just nothing? Edward's voice was heavy. Not nothing. Loss leaves echoes. Your father has carried them all his life, and perhaps in his own cruelty he passed those echoes to you. I stood there hollow. For a fleeting moment I had believed in another survivor, another outcast. Instead, what remained was only absence, the same absence that had shaped us all. And in that absence I recognised a truth. Abandonment wasn't just a wound inflicted once. It was a cycle handed down like inheritance, disguised as silence, etched into blood that was never truly ours. It began quietly, an Instagram post with a photograph of Chloe holding our grandfather's hand. The caption read, "Elder voices silenced by those who crave power. Heartbroken but standing strong." The words didn't mention me directly, but the implication struck like glass shards underfoot. Soon came more posts. Carefully worded appeals about the fragility of ageing, about protecting our elders from manipulation. Within days, Chloe's campaign bled onto Facebook, into glossy op-eds, ghost-written by public relations professionals. She painted herself as the dutiful daughter protecting Edward from my supposed ambition. The narrative spread faster than truth ever could. Lila joined in with her own arsenal. She called cousins in Boston, university trustees she had entertained at charity galas, even an emeritus professor who wrote a glowing essay about family loyalty for a regional paper. Their collective voices wove a net around me, choking the space where I might defend myself. I watched as comments accumulated beneath Chloe's posts, strangers offering sympathy, friends reposting with hashtags about elder rights. Each word chipped away at me, reducing me from daughter to villain, granddaughter to predator. Meanwhile, the legal front advanced. Victor's attorney filed an emergency motion to halt the restructuring Edward had announced. The courtroom smelled of varnish and tension. Their argument was simple. Edward was incompetent, manipulated by me. But when the judge appointed an independent psychiatrist to evaluate him, Edward emerged from the examination with clarity intact. The report declared him capable of making decisions, his occasional lapses explained by age, not dementia. The ruling was a small victory, but even as the gavel fell, I felt the battle spreading beyond the courtroom's walls. The glass war, transparent yet cutting, was being fought in headlines, whispers, and curated images. And I was losing ground. At home, the tension seeped deeper. Miles sat at the kitchen table one evening, his laptop open to an email that seemed to sear his eyes. When I asked, he hesitated before turning the screen toward me. It was a proposal from a philanthropic foundation offering a lucrative consulting role in educational outreach, 3 times his teaching salary. At first it looked harmless, even generous. But as Caleb dug into the foundation's background, he found its board dotted with familiar names. Associates of Victor, men who had once backed his riskier developments. The meaning was clear. This wasn't about valuing Miles's skills. It was about buying influence, seeding division. I stared at the email, my throat tightening. "Did you consider it?" I asked. Miles leaned back, running a hand through his hair. "It would change everything for us, Nora. We've struggled for years. You know how many nights I've stayed up worrying if we can keep this house, pay the bills, plan for a family." His words stung, not because they weren't true, but because they echoed my deepest fear. That even love had a price, and I could not compete with wealth. "I need to know," I whispered, "if you're tempted." He met my eyes, pain flickering there. "I'd be lying if I said I wasn't, but I also know it's a trap." I wanted to believe him, to let his reassurance anchor me, yet doubt lingered, a shadow that Chloe's campaign had already planted. If strangers could be convinced I was capable of exploiting Edward, how long before Miles believed it too? That night I lay awake, listening to his steady breathing beside me, but the distance felt vast. My parents had abandoned me for Chloe. Now I feared the one person who had chosen me might walk away too. Not because he wanted to, but because the world they built made loyalty look like foolishness. The glass war wasn't just breaking my reputation. It was splintering my marriage, one fracture at a time. The morning after sleepless hours, Miles sat across from me at the kitchen table. His eyes were rimmed red, but his voice was steady. "I won't take it," he said, sliding his laptop toward me. The cursor hovered over a drafted reply declining the foundation's offer. "Whatever they're dangling, it's poison, and I won't let them use me to reach you." Relief swept through me so suddenly it left me breathless. For a moment, the fractures in our marriage knit together. He wasn't going to abandon me. Not now. Not for a salary dressed as salvation. He forwarded the entire email chain and attached contract to Caleb. Within hours, Caleb confirmed what we already suspected. The foundation's funding traced back to shell companies tied to Victor's associates. But the war wasn't over. If anything, it had only sharpened. That evening, as the library clock chimed 9, I found a small folded note slipped under my door. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the words were simple. "Meet me by the greenhouse. Midnight. Come alone." Every instinct screamed caution, but curiosity won. I walked through the dew-laden garden under a pale moon, the glass panes of the greenhouse glowing faintly. There, waiting in the shadows, was Greta, my mother's long-time assistant. Her face was lined with tension, her hands clutching a cloth bag. "I shouldn't be doing this," she whispered, glancing over her shoulder. Then she pressed the bag into my arms. "These, she never meant for you to see." Inside were 3 worn leather-bound journals, the edges frayed from years of handling. I recognised my mother's handwriting before I even opened them. Greta's voice cracked. "She recorded everything, every plan, every lie. I can't serve this any longer." And just like that, she vanished into the darkness, leaving me trembling with the weight of secrets pressed to my chest. Back in my room, I opened the first volume. The ink had faded, but the words cut sharp. Entries stretching back 25 years detailed my mother's awareness of Victor's manipulations. In one passage, she wrote, "Edward suspects irregularities, must accelerate before he finds proof. Victor grows reckless. Chloe will be our safeguard." The second journal chronicled years of diversions, how she cultivated alliances at charity galas, how she funneled influence through education boards and cultural committees. The third carried her most recent entries, seething with frustration over Edward's lingering lucidity. "If he will not yield, then we must craft the narrative of his decline. The doctors can be persuaded." I felt the floor tilt. My mother hadn't been a passive accomplice, she had been an architect, orchestrating my grandfather's downfall with chilling precision. When I showed the journals to Caleb the next morning, his face hardened. "This is enough to bury them," but Hale must have realised what had slipped through his fingers. Later that day, the scent of smoke filled the east wing. Rushing toward the archives, we found the charred remains of papers in a wastebasket, Hale's hands still smudged with ash. The fire alarms had triggered quickly, sparing most of the documents, but the intent was unmistakable. He had tried to burn copies of the journals. Unfortunately for him, the Manor's security system had recently been upgraded. Cameras captured every frantic motion, Hale rifling through drawers, striking a match, fanning flames that refused to spread. Cornered, he finally broke. His voice cracked as he admitted what Edward had long suspected. The chain of fraudulent power of attorney documents had been laundered through the Whitmore Foundation. The name landed like a hammer. Whitmore, the bloodline that wasn't ours, the family my grandmother's affair had entangled us with. The foundation was their nexus, a place where money and influence merged. Hale's confession unravelled the knot. Victor's authority had been bolstered not just by forged signatures, but by an entire network tied to Charles Whitmore, his biological father. What had begun as one man's deception had metastasized into a lattice of power stretching across family, money, and legacy. I stood in the middle of the library, the journals heavy in my arms, smoke still clinging to my hair, and felt the grotesque symmetry of it all. My family had always been tangled, but now the tangle had a name, a face, and a ledger. The Whitfield legacy wasn't only ours, it was infected by Whitmore blood, Whitmore money, Whitmore lies. And I was left to hold the fragments, deciding whether to rebuild or burn it all down. News of Victor's disappearance spread like wildfire through the estate. One moment he had been pacing the halls, making whispered calls to his attorneys, and the next he was gone. Slipped onto a private jet bound for a country notorious for shielding wealthy fugitives. No extradition treaties, no real chance of seeing him forced back into the courtroom. The board reacted with a mix of outrage and fear. Investors demanded explanations, journalists camped outside the manor gates, and Edward's phone rang without pause. Caleb's team traced financial trails that had once seemed convoluted but now ended abruptly. Roughly $2 million had vanished into a labyrinth of shell corporations, washed through enough accounts that even experts could only shrug at its final destination. Money, like water, had found its cracks and seeped away, but money was only half the wound. One evening, Ryan arrived unexpectedly, his face drawn tight. He asked me to meet him in the West Garden, away from the ears that lurked in the manor walls. Under the skeletal branches of winter trees, he pulled out his phone and showed me a message that froze my blood. It was from Victor. The text was blunt. "You are still my son. Side with me and I'll give you shares offshore, enough to finance any dream you've ever had." Ryan's voice shook. He knows about the band's struggles, the label meetings that fell through, the debt I'm carrying. He knows exactly where to dig. My throat tightened. For years, Ryan had been the only sibling who didn't claw for our parents' approval, the one who shrugged at real estate and chased music instead. He had been my silent ally, even if his support was often indirect. Now Victor was dangling what Ryan craved most: freedom from failure, a second chance at a dream already slipping away. "You can't," I whispered, desperate. "If you side with him, everything we've built, the trust, Edward's fight, my sanity, it will all collapse." Ryan rubbed his forehead, torn between defiance and despair. "You think I don't know that? But do you know what it's like to work for something for a decade, only to realize you might never make it?" He's offering me a way out. The words cut deeper than I expected. My brother wasn't greedy, he was exhausted, and that made the temptation sharper, more dangerous. I reached for his arm. "Please, Ryan, don't let him steal you from me too. I've lost our parents. Chloe barely speaks to me, and Victor has made me a villain in the public eye. If you go with him, I'll have no one left." For a long time, Ryan didn't answer. His silence was a knife, twisting. I walked back inside that night, fearing I had already lost him, that my father's final weapon was not the stolen millions, but the ability to turn even love into leverage. The despair sank so low, it threatened to drown me. I went through the motions the next morning, meetings, phone calls, paperwork, but everything felt muted, like sound underwater. It was during a routine doctor's appointment, one I had scheduled weeks earlier, that the abyss cracked open and let in a shard of light. The physician smiled after reviewing the scans. "Congratulations, Mrs. Carter, you're 8 weeks pregnant." I blinked, the words slow to take shape. Pregnant, a child, life forming quietly inside me while chaos consumed everything outside. Driving home, tears blurred the road. For the first time in months, joy pierced the fog. It was fragile, yes, too early to celebrate without fear, but it was real, a heartbeat against the silence. That night, lying awake, I pressed a hand to my stomach. Amid betrayal and vanishing fortunes, amid fear of losing Ryan, there was this small miracle. An anchor I hadn't expected, a promise that the Whitfield story wouldn't end with ruin. The war was far from over, but for the first time I felt I had something worth fighting for, beyond legacy, beyond money. I had a future stirring inside me, and I would not let Victor or anyone take it away. Ryan showed up the next morning with an expression that made my breath stall. His eyes were clear, no longer clouded by temptation. "I told him no," he said simply. "I won't be bought. Not by Dad, not by anyone." Relief surged through me so sharply it left me dizzy. Before I could speak, he added, "But I'm not going to hide either. If he wants to tarnish me, let him try. I'll face the board, the investors, everyone. They need to hear the truth." That afternoon, Ryan stood before a crowded conference room. The same confidence he once carried on stage now sharpened into something steadier. He didn't have slides or scripts. He spoke from the gut. Whitfield Properties has been poisoned by secrecy, he told the investors. But secrecy dies in sunlight. From now on, every project, every dollar will be transparent. That's our promise. My sister and I may not have chosen this fight, but we will finish it with honesty. There was power in his delivery, the rhythm of a performer, the conviction of a brother who had chosen loyalty over escape. Applause followed, tentative at first, then firm. For the first time since Victor fled, I felt the tide begin to shift. But victories never lasted long in our world. 2 days later, Caleb stormed into the manor with a file that made my stomach twist. We found the missing trail, he said. The 2 million passed through accounts linked to... He hesitated, then dropped the name like a hammer. Your former band manager, Ryan. The room went silent. Ryan's face drained of colour. That's impossible. But the documents were stark. Wire transfers routed through companies tied to the man who had once promised Ryan a record deal. On paper, it looked damning, a neat loop that suggested complicity. My chest clenched. After all his vows, after the speech that steadied our investors, was it possible Victor had already ensnared him? Ryan's voice broke. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know. Caleb's team dug deeper. For hours we pored over contracts, receipts, scraps of correspondence. Then one piece surfaced that shifted everything. A series of signed cash deposit slips bearing Victor's signature funneled through the manager as nothing more than a courier. He was just the mule, Caleb concluded. Victor used his old connection to mask the transfers. Ryan wasn't involved. The relief that followed was like breaking the surface after drowning. Ryan sagged into a chair, running a hand over his face. He almost ruined me twice, he murmured. First my music career, now this. I wanted to tell him it was over, that the storm had passed, but my own body betrayed me before I could. The room tilted, colours bleeding into each other. My hands slipped from the table as darkness closed in. The last thing I heard was Ryan shouting my name. When I woke, I was in my own bed. The air smelled faintly of coffee and toast, sunlight spilling across the curtains. Edward sat in a chair beside me, his hands folded over his cane, watching with a softness I had rarely seen. You've been pushing too hard, he said. Your body decided it was time to remind you of its limits. Shame pricked my eyes. I can't stop. Not now. There's too much at stake. He shook his head. What's at stake is you, Nora, and the child you're carrying. Do not let this war steal what matters most. For the next week, Edward moved into our modest home. Seacliff Manor was too heavy with schemes. Here, mornings began with eggs sizzling on the stove, coffee mugs warm in our hands, Ryan dropping by with bagels, Miles reading headlines aloud. For the first time in years, we were a family without grandeur, without ceremony. Just a cluster of people bound by blood, love, and survival, choosing each other over legacy. And in those quiet breakfasts, I realised something. The empire could burn, the money could vanish, but this fragile circle was what I had been yearning for all along. Edward gathered us in the library one last time, though this time the weight in the air was different. The smoke of betrayal had settled, leaving only dust and fatigue. He looked around at us, at me, at Ryan, even at Chloe, who hovered near the back, as if unsure whether she belonged. And then he spoke with the finality of a judge. I'm selling Seacliff Manor. The words hit harder than I expected. This house, with its endless corridors of portraits and hidden rot, had shaped us all. It had been both palace and prison. To imagine it belonging to strangers felt like tearing down a monument, even if that monument was built on lies. Chloe gasped, eyes wide. But it's been in the family for 3 generations. Edward's gaze didn't waver. And in that time, it has harboured secrets, resentments, and schemes. A house remembers. This one remembers too much. The decision wasn't negotiable. Within hours, preparations began. Appraisers combed through rooms, cataloguing antiques and ledgers, peeling back layers of dust and history. It was during one of these inspections that Ryan discovered the locked door. Tucked behind a row of shelves in the east wing, it had gone unnoticed for years. The key, oddly enough, was hidden in Edward's desk. Inside, the room smelled of mildew and neglect. A single filing cabinet stood against the wall, its drawers swollen with damp paper. On a table sat a box of microfilm reels and a stack of ledgers so brittle they crumbled at the edges. Caleb's eyes sharpened the moment he saw them. "These are older than Victor's tenure," he said, carefully lifting one reel. The ledgers told a story no one had anticipated. Transactions dating back more than a decade revealed patterns of inflated costs, siphoned funds, and quiet payoffs to obscure contractors. Many of the names were small-town developers, men who lacked the means to challenge someone like Victor. They had signed deals under duress, their losses buried under the shadow of Whitfield prestige. "This isn't just Victor's corruption," Caleb murmured. "It's systemic. He wove these patterns into the company years ago, long before Edward began stepping back. The scale is bigger than we thought." Edward studied the records in silence, his face lined with grief. "I entrusted him with everything," he finally said, "and he built an empire of deceit within my own walls." For me, the discovery was less a revelation and more a confirmation. Every time I had been dismissed, every project handed to Chloe, every subtle reminder that I was never enough, it all tied back to this rot. The business I had dedicated my life to was riddled with sickness, and I had been expected to ignore the stench, but Edward was done ignoring. He ordered a full audit and declared a purge. "Any property tainted by these dealings will be sold. We will shed poisoned assets until only clean foundations remain." The phrase struck me. Poisoned assets. Harbour Crest, Windermere, the Newport estate. Each had been tarnished, not just by money, but by intent. And yet amid the wreckage, there was hope. Ryan and I worked side by side for weeks, meeting with community leaders, redirecting capital toward projects along the lakefront. We designed plans for mixed-use developments, green spaces, affordable housing initiatives. Instead of chasing glittering towers in distant cities, we chose to build where people lived, where roots mattered. Investors balked at first, wary of diminished returns, but Ryan used the same charisma that had once swayed club owners to book his band. He painted pictures of thriving communities, of families who could finally afford homes near their work, of profits steady rather than inflated. Slowly, the tide turned. At night, I returned to our small home where Edward now sat at the kitchen table reviewing papers with quiet determination. He was no longer the patriarch presiding from a gilded throne. He was simply a man trying to salvage what remained. Watching him eat toast while Miles graded essays and Ryan strummed a guitar on the porch, I realised this was the family I had longed for, stripped of grandeur, bound by choice. Seacliff Manor would soon belong to another, its walls no longer echoing with whispers. And though part of me mourned, another part exhaled. The house had been both sanctuary and snare, but now we had the chance to build anew, free of the ghosts hidden in its rooms. The restructuring of Whitfield Properties wasn't just about money anymore. It was about rewriting the rules of how we lived as a family. Edward insisted that the new trust include not only financial provisions, but ethical ones, clauses designed to bind our conduct as tightly as our signatures. Caleb helped draft the language, but the heart of it came from Edward himself. "We've been torn apart by selfishness," he told us, his voice firm though age lined his face. "From now on, if anyone attempts to cast out another member of this family for personal gain, ostracizing, slandering, or exiling, they will lose their voting rights in the trust. And 10% of their profits will be diverted into the community housing fund." I blinked at the severity. It was unprecedented, maybe even draconian, but I understood the intent. The clause was both shield and sword, a way to ensure that no one could ever again use abandonment as a weapon, the very wound that had shaped me since childhood. For the first time, the system itself would punish betrayal. The announcement rippled through our circle. Ryan nodded in approval, his expression grave. Miles squeezed my shoulder as if to say this was justice long overdue, and then, to my surprise, Chloe raised her hand. "I want in," she said. The room stilled. She looked younger than her 26 years, stripped of the arrogance she usually wore. "I don't want the penthouse or the credit cards or the offices I never deserved. I want to move to the foundation. Let me handle the charitable wing and pay me whatever you think is fair, even if it's controlled." For a moment I couldn't breathe. This was Chloe, the sister whose portraits filled the manor walls while mine were buried in the attic. The one who had smiled through every advantage while I scraped for scraps. And now she was asking for limits, for accountability. Edward studied her carefully. "If you mean this, the board will approve. But once you step into that role, there's no going back to indulgence. Your salary will be capped, your expenses monitored, every dollar audited." Chloe nodded. "That's what I want. I need to prove to myself more than anyone that I can do something real." It was the first flicker of redemption I'd seen in her, and though my instincts screamed not to trust it, part of me softened. Perhaps she was ready to shed the crown she had never earned. Meanwhile, my own home was changing too. Miles approached me one evening with his school bag in hand, his expression hesitant. "I've asked to reduce my teaching hours," he said. Fear surged instantly. "Are you leaving?" He shook his head quickly. "No, I want to be here more. With you. With what's coming." His eyes flicked to my stomach, the secret we hadn't yet shared beyond our walls. "I don't want you to go through this alone." Tears blurred my vision. For weeks I had braced myself for his departure, convinced that the temptations of wealth or the exhaustion of scandal would drive him away. Instead, he was choosing to stay to anchor himself beside me. We spent mornings together now, walking along the shoreline before I went to the office. He graded fewer essays but read more drafts of my speeches, reminding me that words matter as much as numbers. At night, he held me, steady and unyielding, proof that not every bond bends under pressure. It was, in his own quiet way, a revolution. The old Whitfield order had thrived on exclusion. One child favoured, another dismissed, loyalty weaponized like currency. Now the new trust carried consequences for that cruelty. Chloe was beginning a path of restitution, and Miles had chosen presence over ambition. For the first time, I felt the cycle of abandonment begin to break. The land on the far side of the lake was nothing like Seacliff Manor. Where the manor loomed with history and shadow, this stretch of earth was open and bright, kissed by sunlight that danced across the water. Edward had purchased it decades ago, but left it untouched, as if waiting for the right moment. Now that moment had come. Architects had drawn up plans for 3 new homes, modern yet modest, built to invite light rather than hoard it. One for Edward, a smaller dwelling where he could spend his final years surrounded by quiet. One for Ryan and his fiancée, a brilliant environmental lawyer whose passion for sustainability matched his newfound commitment to rebuilding the company. And one for me, Miles, and the child who stirred softly within me, a place to begin again without the weight of portraits that had never included me. But the blueprints held a 4th lot, left deliberately blank. A sketch, nothing more. Edward presented it as both challenge and invitation. If Chloe proves herself, he said, if she continues down this new path of service rather than indulgence, then she will have a place here too, but only then. The symbolism was undeniable. For once, her future wasn't guaranteed by favouritism. It would be earned by choice. The day of the groundbreaking dawned crisp, the sky a clear wash of blue. We gathered on the plot that would one day hold our homes. A crowd of local officials, company partners, and curious neighbours stood nearby, watching as history bent itself into something new. Edward, frail but resolute, was handed the first shovel. He pressed it into the earth with effort, but managed a small smile as soil lifted free. Ryan followed, his fiancée at his side, their hands overlapping on the handle, as if already laying the foundation of their marriage. When it was my turn, I took the shovel and felt its weight. Miles placed a hand on my back, steadying me, and together we guided the handle downward. I bent slightly, pressing my other hand against my stomach, imagining the tiny life inside me lending its own strength. The gesture felt symbolic, a mother's hand guiding her child's, breaking ground not just for a house, but for a legacy stripped of deceit. Applause rippled across the crowd. For the first time in years, I felt pride untainted by bitterness. This was ours, clean soil, clean beginnings. But just as the ceremony reached its peak, a figure emerged from the crowd. Dressed in a dark suit, carrying a leather satchel, he moved with the certainty of someone on official duty. When he reached us, his voice carried above the murmurs. "Mrs. Nora Carter?" I nodded cautiously. He withdrew a stack of papers, stamped and sealed. "You've been served." The silence that followed was deafening. I reached out, my hands trembling as I accepted the documents. The header glared back at me. Victor Whitfield v. the estate of Edward Whitfield. A lawsuit. Filed from abroad. The whispers erupted instantly, partners muttering, journalists scrambling for notes, neighbours exchanging wide-eyed glances. The ground that moments earlier had felt steady now seemed to quake beneath me. Ryan cursed under his breath. Miles stepped closer, shielding me with his body as though the papers themselves were weapons. Edward's face darkened, but he stood taller than I'd seen him in weeks. "This is a scare tactic," Caleb whispered urgently, scanning the documents. "He's trying to rattle you, make you doubt this moment." But the damage was done. The joy of breaking ground, the symbolism of starting anew had been punctured. I clutched the shovel tighter, my hand still pressed against my stomach. The child inside me deserved more than a life spent running from my father's shadow. I lifted my chin, forcing my voice steady. "Then we'll fight him, here, there, anywhere he tries. But we won't stop building." The crowd erupted in applause again, though this time it carried a defiant edge. The ground was broken, not just for houses, but for the war that would decide whether we could ever truly claim peace. The lawsuit cast a shadow over the groundbreaking, but within days, Caleb uncovered something extraordinary. Victor's attorneys had been careless. In their haste to intimidate us, they filed the complaint with attachments meant to strengthen their claim. But buried among the exhibits were scanned copies of Victor's passport, flight itineraries, and, most damning of all, wire logs linking his accounts directly to offshore transfers. It was as if he had handed us the rope with which to hang him. Caleb smirked when he dropped the folder on the table. This isn't a case, it's a confession. His lawyer practically gift-wrapped it for the Department of Justice. Edward's eyes gleamed with something between triumph and sorrow. "Arrogance," he said softly. "It makes fools of even the clever." The DOJ moved swiftly once the evidence was passed along. Investigators launched a wider probe, not just into Victor, but into the Whitmore Foundation, pulling at every thread that had once seemed untouchable. For the first time, I believed that justice might not only be possible, but inevitable. But the true surprise came from Chloe. One afternoon, she requested a private meeting. Her usual poise was gone. She looked smaller, stripped of pretense. She slid a handwritten statement across the table. "It's my admission," she said, voice trembling. "I signed documents without reading them, parroted what Dad told me, and let myself be his pawn. I want the DOJ to have this, and I want you to see that I'm not hiding anymore." I scanned the pages. She didn't spare herself. She confessed to her ignorance, her complicity, even her vanity. But at the end, she pledged something new, to commit fully to the community foundation, to use her position to repair the harm she had helped perpetuate. Tears stung my eyes. For so long, Chloe had been the emblem of everything I wasn't: chosen, adored, elevated. Now she was offering to dismantle that pedestal herself. Edward, ever the strategist, nodded. "You will serve a probationary term. If you keep this path, the 4th foundation lot will be yours. But not before you prove it." Chloe accepted without hesitation. For once, she wasn't asking to be chosen. She was choosing to do the work. The months that followed were grueling. The DOJ investigation widened, headlines roared, and yet inside our smaller circle, something remarkable unfolded. Chloe threw herself into the foundation, drafting grants for affordable housing, meeting with local families, even volunteering weekends at shelters. Ryan grew into his role as trustee, balancing charm with resolve. Miles kept his promise, reducing his hours to walk beside me through each doctor's appointment, each sleepless night of worry and hope. And Edward, though his strength waned, seemed lighter, as if selling Seacliff Manor and unburdening our legacy had allowed him to breathe freely again. When construction finally began on the new homes, I stood once more on the lake shore, shovel in hand. Ryan laughed beside his fiancée. Chloe arrived with stacks of paperwork for the foundation, and Miles rested his palm gently on my back. The 4th lot remained bare, but no longer ominous. It was a promise, a space waiting for redemption, not guaranteed, but possible. I pressed my hand against my stomach, feeling the life that had grown there, steady and undeniable. For years, I had begged silently to be chosen, to be seen by my parents, to be given what Chloe had been handed without effort. But standing there, surrounded by those who had chosen me in return, Edward, Ryan, Miles, I realised the cycle had finally broken. I wasn't the abandoned daughter anymore. I wasn't the overlooked trustee in waiting. I was simply Nora Whitfield. A woman who had chosen herself, chosen truth, chosen a family, rebuilt not by favoritism, but by responsibility. And for the first time in my life, that was enough.